Hello again, I'm here to read another chapter from my book, Lessons from Life. And we're still working our way through the Sermon on the Mount. We're in chapter 7, verse 14 of Matthew. And Jesus is talking about the narrow way. This is a message to Christians, not to unbelievers. The wisdom in this chapter interprets itself. We need only understand the key words, which are straight, narrow, life, and few. Straight means tight, restricted, limited, confining. Narrow means it doesn't get any better once you're through the gate. It always stays restricted. There's no room for deviation, doing your own thing, or taking along your own agendas, decisions, or preferences. Why should a narrow, restricted, awkward, confined way lead to life? Because Jesus walked that way, and we're following him. In John 6:38, Jesus said, "I came down from heaven not to do mine own will, but the will of him that sent me." To never be able to do your own will, what you want to do, is pretty restricting. And God's will was not easy for Jesus, for it was God's will that he went the way of death. There is never any fruit without death, without the seed first dying in the ground. And even when the tree grows up, without pruning, you may get a little fruit. God's purpose is not a big tree, but much fruit, and that means pruning. The narrow way leads to life. Discipline leads to freedom. No one was more free than Jesus, yet no one was ever more restricted. The disciples' life may seem horribly restricting, yet they seem more free and content than people who have all the so-called freedoms of wealth, health, success, and everything that goes with the broad way. Few Christians find it. No cross, no crown. When I read through this article that Morris had written to see if I could write anything to complement it, I was in a dilemma. Could I think of any situations in my own life which could give you an indication as to what the straight and narrow way could mean, or can we only see this in a spiritual way? Well, as I pondered, I could see many incidents which had thrown me off the straight and narrow, times when I'd conformed to the world and been part of the system, just doing what everyone else does, although the things I did were not particularly what you would call sinful. We all start out our journey, whether Christian or non-Christian, on the straight and narrow way. A child begins its life in a tightly restricted area, the womb, totally protected from outside elements. The birth is through an incredibly straight and narrow birth canal, and as soon as the child is born, it's washed and swaddled in tight blankets, because this very restriction gives the baby security and comfort. But after that, the fight for independence begins, and unless someone applies restrictions along the way, the child will become a selfish, willful, inconsiderate hooligan who is a law unto itself. There is no freedom for the Christian. Jesus freed us from slavery to the devil by paying the price for our sin, but we have now been bought. We're not our own. We are now the property, servants of the Lord Jesus Christ, and have an obligation to fulfill the will of God in our bodies, minds, and spirits. If we don't do God's will, then we're in actual fact rebellious, stealing our own life, which is the property of God, so that we can live as we please. But is the fact that we have no freedom a horrible situation to be in? If it is, then Jesus must have been the most miserable person ever to walk this earth, because he said on numerous occasions that he did nothing of himself. He only did what the Father showed him to do. He didn't heal one sick person without his Father telling him to do it. He never spoke to anyone unless his Father told him to. He never went anywhere without his Father's permission. He was driven by the Spirit of his Father into the wilderness to fast for 40 days and be tempted of the devil. He desperately pleaded with his Father in the Garden of Gethsemane to be released from giving his life on the cross. Any other way, Father? You can do all things. Yet not my will, yours be done. Was Jesus miserable? Did he find the Christian life too hard, too restrictive, too narrow? I don't think so. He said that his very meat, his food, was to do the will of his Father in heaven. He seemed to delight in the close communion relationship which he had with his Father. He even neglected to sleep at night because being with God was so important. He was at peace when all around him was in turmoil. He wouldn't even have bothered to still the storm if the disciples hadn't woken him from his sleep. He was at peace with God at all times. I've cast my mind back over my life to see how I've reacted when I've been restricted from doing my will by God. I remember on one occasion when I was about 23 years old and had courted a fascination for a very handsome, wealthy, worldly man who was paying me quite a great deal of attention. He'd invited me out for the day. I knew I shouldn't be with him. I was a Christian and he wasn't. I knew I was playing with fire. But the fire at that time seemed warm and appealing, and suddenly my Christianity seemed too restrictive and confining. I was young and I wanted to enjoy myself. I accepted his invitation, so he called for me in his flash car. I just hoped that nobody from my church saw me with him and consequently kept my head down whilst we were driving through the neighbourhood. But when he said he had to call in at the office and the business he owned and to pick something up, I just knew something was going to happen to ruin the plan. And I was right. When we arrived at the firm he owned and were getting out of his car, another vehicle rolled up. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw who it was. It was the pastor's son. He got out of his car and came over to me as I stared at him in disbelief. He motioned for me to wind the window down, and then he said he had come to take me home. You know, I was mesmerised. You can't imagine how I felt. I was embarrassed, frustrated, frightened, confused, angry, you name it. I was so many emotions rolled into one. I got out of the car that I was in like someone sleepwalking, and I got into the brother's parked vehicle. My worldly boyfriend stood transfixed in bewildered amazement because I was just walking away from him, and he was so very, very wealthy, attractive and impressive. I remember vividly the journey home to my house. I was freaked out. I knew God was stopping me from getting into trouble, but to be quite honest, I wanted to get in trouble. I wanted to be free from God for a few hours, but he wouldn't release me. In those minutes, I felt as though something sinister was happening to me. "This is nothing but satanic," I yelled. "God is supposed to be a gentleman and never do anything that we don't want him to do. He would never take my free will away." I was so confused because I had an understanding of God which wasn't true. But then this strange feeling came over me, and I suddenly felt very loved, very cared for, and very special. Fancy God going to all that trouble to make sure I didn't do something I would regret. I felt those tight, swaddling clothes wrapped around me, and it made me feel incredibly secure. If God's fathered you, then don't expect him to let you get away with doing what you want to do. Like any loving parent, he will keep close tabs on you and make you feel very uncomfortable at times to let you know you're overstepping the mark. The problem really comes when you have matured spiritually enough, in his view, to make your own decisions and face the consequences your actions may bring. God writes his law in your heart and in your mind, and he'll not give you peace while ever you're pondering about what decision you're going to make until you've made your choice. And when you've come to your decision, either to follow his will or your own, then conviction ceases and you have peace. If you've made the right decision, then this peace is wonderful and will bring the peaceable fruits of righteousness. But if you've made the wrong decision, then this peace means that God is not striving with you any longer. You've hardened up and He's handed you over to a reprobate mind because you have decided not to listen to His voice. God will never force you to serve Him. He's always seeking voluntary surrender from a heart that's filled with love for Him. I face decisions every day. My walk with God requires me to feed my new nature and starve my old nature. Hundreds of situations crop up every day where I have to choose which path to follow. I never buy newspapers or magazines because I know that when I read the scandal, gossip and all the other smutty stuff that finds its way into the pages, it only feeds my old nature. Sometimes, maybe when I'm in a dentist's waiting room or somewhere similar, I'll be tempted to pick up a magazine just to pass the time. And when I've done this, I've felt eyes on the back of my head, as though Big Brother was watching me. Sometimes it's really annoyed me that I don't feel free. But most of the time, I'm really grateful that God is keeping my conscience towards Him soft. Because whenever we harden up, His voice will stop speaking. But we're all human, I've heard people say. Yeah, that's true. So was Jesus whilst He was in an earthly body. That's why He said, "Not my will, but thine be done." If we're to allow God to live through us, then we have to deny our human desires and do only the things we know will please God. When you're about to do something, ask yourself whether you'd be happy or embarrassed if Jesus was to be visibly standing beside you, witnessing everything you did. Whether it's keeping the wrong company, doing wrong things, going to the wrong places, saying and listening to wrong things. Allow yourself to be soft to God. Don't harden your hearts like the children of Israel did. Allow God to have His will in your life. Romans 12 verses 1 and 2 says, "Present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Restricting? Yes. Demanding? Yes. But it'll bring real peace that only God can give. My peace I give unto you, not as the world gives. Worldly peace comes from blotting out His voice when we hear it, and eventually God stops speaking to us. But then He hands us over to a reprobate mind. He leaves us to get into as much trouble as we want, but will judge us severely on the day of reckoning. On the contrary, the peace that Jesus gives to those who respond to His voice is real and true, because we're right with God. And we're promised that the experience of this peace passes all understanding. And let's face it, in this troubled world, we all desperately need this kind of peace. God bless you.